So now having started, the next thing I want to do is talk with you about what I consider to be my big four, the four heuristics that I always think about. And these are unlikely to become the core of your repertoire of speaking heuristics, but they happen to be my four, and they're given here to illustrate the idea that you can have a central set that suit your style. Here are my big four. First thing I like to remind myself when I begin a talk is to cycle in on the material. To say it again, and to say it a third time. Now some people will say, well, this is because the audience is stupid and they need 3 times in order to understand what you're saying, but that's not so. There are 2 much better ways to think about this. One is from the perspective of psychology, and one is from the perspective of probability. From the perspective of psychology, what that first loop does is it helps people bring in from long-term memory the right elements that they need in order to understand and put together what you're going to be giving them on the second and the third cycles. From the point of view of probability, this cycling has to do with the fact that in any audience, about 20% are certain to be fogged out at any given time. They'll be thinking about something else. So if you want to reduce the probability that a particular individual will miss what you're saying to less than 1%, all you need to do is say it 3 times, and the laws of probability tell you you've done your job. The probability of missing it all 3 times will be less than 1%. The second thing that I like to do, and that I consider a part of my big four, is to use verbal punctuation. By that I mean, in recognition of the fact that people will fog out during a talk, you need to provide them with some mechanisms that indicate that to them when it's time to get back on board. In this talk, for example, I might start by saying, here I am, talking about the big four. I've already talked about starting. I've given you the first of my big four heuristics, and now I'm talking about the second one. So that's what I call verbal punctuation. And it's an effective technique even if you lose track of where you are in the counting sequence. You should go to the Kennedy Library and listen to the famous debates between Nixon and Kennedy during the 1960 campaign. At one point there was a discussion of whether we should go to war over the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. And Kennedy's reply to Nixon was, well, I have several points to say in connection with that, several points to offer. First, he said something. Second, he said something. Second, he said something. He lost track of where he was in counting, but it didn't matter. The numbers themselves served as verbal boundaries between the points and helped people who were fogged out to get back on board. So that's verbal punctuation, the second of my big four. The third thing that I like to be mindful of is to use the concept of the near miss. By that I mean when I'm teaching a difficult concept, I like to describe not only the concept, maybe I'm teaching a Martian about arches, I like to talk about not only the concept, but something that isn't the concept but doesn't miss being the concept by much, a near miss. So that's not an arch, and it helps to surround the concept of what an arch is with a boundary. That's not an arch, that's not an arch. By comparing those examples with something that is an arch, I can immediately conclude that it's important for the lying down object to be on top and for there to be a space in between the upright objects. So that's surrounding the concept with near misses that help to establish its boundaries and provides an effective way to zero in on just what the concept is about. Now the last thing in this list of 4 central heuristics for me is a heuristic that I like to use frequently, especially when I sense that an audience has fogged out or needs to be brought back into my talk. And it's a heuristic that helps to engage the audience. Can anyone suggest to me what might be done in that connection?
You can ask the audience something.
Yes, you can ask a question. The rhetorical question. They should be frequent, and they should be answerable. There's nothing an audience hates worse than obscure questions that can't be answered. So if you find yourself asking rhetorical questions and your students don't answer you often, then they're probably too hard. And you should also note that it's appropriate to wait a little while to get an answer. When you're standing in front of an audience of any size, just a few seconds seems like an eternity to the speaker, but not long at all to people in the audience. I paused for 5 seconds between the time that I asked the question and then demanded an answer. And that seemed like an eternity to me, but for an audience it's not much at all. So now what have I done? I've given you my outline, I've talked about my purpose, I've discussed how to start, and I've given you my big four. And in some sense we're already through, because I believe that I've accomplished my objective. I've asserted that it's possible to have knowledge about speaking, and I've given you some samples of what bits and pieces of knowledge might look like. And now you could go home and say to yourself, well, I will begin to develop my own repertoire, my own armamentarium of speaking heuristics that suit my style and will make me a better speaker. So having accomplished that objective, then, I can say to you that the rest of this talk is about some other heuristics that I use personally that treat to such questions as time and place, the use of the blackboard, the virtues and non-virtues of the overhead transparency, the use of props, matters of style, special occasions, and then how to stop. So that's what's left in this talk, and now we might as well proceed with that.